Greetings. In this, the 8th episode of English Sovereigns, I will be discussing Aethelstan, the first king of the English. When Edward the Elder died in 924, he left perhaps somewhat of a power vacuum between Aethelstan, who was declared the King of Mercia, and Aelfweard, who was declared the King of Wessex. Aelfweard was the son of Edward through his second marriage to Aelfled, and the noblemen of Wessex tended to support Aelfled over Aethelstan. If you remember from Edward the Elder's podcast, Aethelstan may have been a bastard, or at least the marriage was done in secret, and Aethelstan was not necessarily given huge amounts of acknowledgement as the heir apparent in the same way that Aelfweard was. But nevertheless, conveniently, Aelfweard died about 3 weeks into his reign as king, which is why he's not really considered as the King of Wessex and why we've jumped straight to Aethelstan here. That probably averted a big civil war. We don't know how Aelfweard died, but we know that when Aethelstan did become king, because Edward the Elder's children through his third marriage to Eadgifu of Kent were too young to inherit, so Aethelstan was the obvious candidate. But the noblemen of Wessex still were not entirely receptive to Aethelstan and actually blockaded them out of Winchester, which was kind of the capital of Wessex, even though Wessex had a sort of moving capital. They blocked him out there for quite a while, so it wasn't immediately accepted, but they were sort of wrong to do that. I mean, he may have been seen as an outsider, but really he did quite a lot to further the cause of England, and as I mentioned, he was the first king of the English. And I think, like Alfred, Aethelstan is deserving of the title Great, or at least the Strong, something to show that what he did was clearly worthy of more recognition in history books, I think. So the tables really had turned by the time Aethelstan became king, because obviously when, say, Alfred became king, Wessex was the last kingdom. Now it was the Danes who were facing the title the Last Kingdom. York was the last kingdom. It was ruled by a Norseman named Sihtric. Although Aethelstan was on fairly good terms with Sihtric, he married his sister Edith to Sihtric, but Sihtric died himself in 927, and Aethelstan saw this as a fantastic opportunity to simply walk into York and take it, which meant that for the first time the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were united under one king. And this was somewhat confirmed at Emont, which is in Penrithshire, which is the border of Scotland roughly. The King of Alba, which is modern day Scotland, you could probably say. Strathclyde, which is kind of like the southern section of Scotland. All the Welsh kings all came and paid homage to Aethelstan as the overlord of the British Isles. This was a level of predominance that we would not see for at least another 300 years, perhaps till Edward I came to power in the year 1272. But yes, Aethelstan surely is deserving of the title King of England, even though I don't think he called himself King of England, he called himself the King of the English, which is why this podcast is called English Sovereigns and not necessarily Sovereigns of England. However, this piece was, or this domination from Aethelstan was fragile, and his authority was actually tested at 937 via the Battle of Brunabere near modern-day Chester, where Sihtric's nephew invaded with a little help from Constantine, the King of Alba, who had submitted to Aethelstan back 10 years back. Aethelstan took a while to prepare for this battle, much to the consternation of some of his noblemen, but he won the day, fortunately. Had he have lost, it would have probably been fatal for the House of Wessex, and probably it's a hypothetical, but you can't quite be clear whether or not England would have existed, but it was essential that he won that. And yeah, his personal prestige was so boosted, as was his authority, went sky high upon victory at Brunanburh. But however, like Alfred, his victories weren't just of a military kind. He enlarged the Witan to encompass newly conquered and subjugated lands that had been added again under his father Edward, and then of course under himself. He added thanes, which are kind of like the underlings of noblemen, the reeves, who were the royal officials in the noble households, various magnates and people, keeping Wessex as centralised as possible, given all the new people that he was governing. You could argue that it was possibly a prototype of the English Parliament, which obviously we see nowadays, but people would say began under the reign of King Henry III with Simon de Montfort. And it's probably fair to say it began then, but you could also argue that the sort of concept of representedness, the people being represented, was perhaps inadvertently, you can't quite know because it was so long ago, but it was perhaps began, or the sort of culture of it was it was there in a sense. It's like, yes, well, these people need some degree of representation, and Aethelstan is enlarging that. But beyond no illusion, Aethelstan did it to centralise his own power and make sure royal authority ran as tightly as possible across the land. Further to that, there is plenty of evidence that he made lots of charters, meticulously controlling the land distribution, which again helps with centralisation, because obviously the power to give land comes from him, and the fact that he gave so many suggests that he was the top dog, and that wasn't just because of his title. His title actually, as king, meant something more than just ceremonially being king. He also expanded King Alfred's law codes. There were more legal texts produced by him than of any other English king, which is remarkable given how long ago Aethelstan's reign was, that most legal texts survive from his reign in comparison to other sovereigns that we've had. Aethelstan also manoeuvred a little bit abroad, which is something perhaps would be unheard of. Say in the reign of King Alfred even, or the early reign of King Alfred maybe, he helped his son-in-law Alan of Brittany and married some of his other sisters off to European monarchs, such as the King of West Francia, which became France, which really shows the prestige that the House of Wessex had accrued, that he was in a position to basically say no to other monarchs. If he didn't think the prestige of another house in Europe was good enough, he would say no, but in other places he would say yes, because it would be of great benefit to him and indeed the other monarch who was asking for the hand in marriage. So Aethelstan clearly did quite a lot there to show that England, or the Kingdom of England, was a force to be reckoned with, really. And it probably would be completed with Aethelstan, you could say. This didn't last, as we'll find out in the next few podcasts, the clear hegemony of the King of the English. But he certainly made great strides. I mean, he died in the year 939 when his prestige was at an all-time high. And I think he certainly should be called the Great. I don't think he is as great as Alfred, because Alfred kind of fought back against all odds, whilst Aethelstan had been left quite a good inheritance from Edward. Obviously, once it was kind of convenient that Aelfweard, his half brother, was dead within a few weeks of becoming king in 924. But he was in a stronger position than Alfred ever was when he became king. So not as great as Alfred, but I think Aethelstan should still be called Aethelstan the Great for what he did, because he was the first king of the English. Well, that is it for Aethelstan. And it's kind of it for the first part of this podcast series. These first 8 monarchs of Wessex / the English-speaking peoples, as it were, I've kind of called, I don't know, perhaps constructing England or making England, because England wasn't really a thing. But from here on in, the next part of it, the next few monarchs, will be part of the second part, called maintaining England, because that was perhaps just as hard as constructing it. Thank you very much, and I'll see you for King Edmund's next time.